A black and white family portrait hangs on a wall in a room that has seen more headlines than births. In the photograph, a cluster of smiles looks toward a future that, at the time, felt all but assured. Sons in navy uniforms, daughters in pearls, a father with the composure of a man who had both bought his way to power and believed he had earned it. But around that portrait, there are empty places where people should be. Chairs kept vacant after funerals, collars folded around coffins, dates on grave markers that should never have existed. The image is ordinary and extraordinary at once, a dynasty as dazzling as it was fragile. The question that haunts the picture and that follows the family across decades of America's mid-century history is blunt and irresistible. The Kennedy curse. Did a family secret destroy the Kennedys? It is a striking way to start because the word curse both simplifies and seduces. It promises an explanation that is dramatic and singular. The work ahead resists that promise in favor of a different method, careful reconstruction, weighing of competing hypotheses, and a steady attention to the record. We will map the family's ascent to unprecedented influence, trace the string of private calamities and public catastrophes that later generations would knit into a narrative of doom, and probe whether a hidden recurring cause, what some contemporaries and later writers have called a secret, can be credibly linked to the pattern. At every turn, claims will be labeled by confidence, and conjectures will be treated as what they are, hypotheses to be tested against documents, testimony, and expert analysis. The story of the Kennedys begins in the architecture of ambition. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., the family's patriarch, is the most decisive figure in that architecture. He arrived in Boston's Irish Catholic society at a moment when political machines and commercial opportunity overlapped, and he built a fortune that would fund political campaigns, social projects, and a very particular cultivation of public image. The outlines of his career are well known. Financial ventures in the 1910s and 1920s, investments in film and real estate, and a stint at the apex of diplomatic life as ambassador to the court of St. James's in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Source needed: biographies of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., ambassadorial appointment records. Whether every element of his rise involved ethically ambiguous decisions is a matter for historians. What is beyond reasonable doubt is that he believed money and patronage could buy access to political power, and that he was determined to shape his sons into a political dynasty. That determination was accompanied by a particular family code, a mix of Catholic piety, social polish, and an insistence on controlling narratives. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, the matriarch, provided a private counterweight, rigid devotion to ritual, mothering that encompassed both tenderness and a demand for propriety. The family's private life was not a watertight vault, but it was disciplined in ways that made both protection and concealment possible. Letters, diaries, and the testimony of confidants portray a household where appearances were curated and missteps minimized, sometimes in public ways and sometimes behind closed doors. Source needed: family papers, Rose Kennedy memoirs, contemporary press accounts. From these private structures flowed public strategy. The Kennedys used their wealth as both seed and fertilizer for political ambition. Joe Sr. invested in his eldest son's education and positioned them in institutions of prestige, the ship's officers and Harvard dormitories that supplied grooming and credentials. The family's marriages, too, can be read as social investments, unions that increased social capital as much as they produced heirs. This was not an unusual posture for elite American families in the first half of the 20th century, but the Kennedys carried it with the force of a deliberate program. Money to build power, power to build sons and daughters into public figures, and public figures to cement the family's influence. The ascent had early public triumphs. John Fitzgerald Kennedy's wartime service, most famously on PT 109, became part of the family's heroic narrative in the 1940s and 1950s. Source needed: PT 109 service records, contemporary newspaper coverage. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., the intended first scion, entered military service with high expectations and was widely viewed as the son who would carry the family's banner into national prominence. Source needed: military records, family correspondence. Robert Francis Kennedy emerged as a compiler of legal expertise and an energetic political strategist, eventually joining his brother's administration and becoming, in his own right, a national figure. Source needed: RFK public record. Edward M. Ted Kennedy later anchored the family's long congressional career. Source needed: Senate records. Yet the family's rise and the very public persona it cultivated were accompanied by private vulnerabilities, episodes that at times were hidden from the press and at other times leaked into public view in ways that shaped perception. One daughter, Rose's third child, Rosemary, underwent a lobotomy as a young woman and lived thereafter in institutional care, an event that family archives and later accounts describe with regret and secrecy. Source needed: medical records, family archives, Rosemary Kennedy documentation. Another daughter, Kathleen Kick Kennedy, died in a plane crash in 1948 while living in England. Her death was a shock that fractured family dreams and public fascination alike. Source needed: contemporary news reports, aviation records. Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr. died in a wartime mission in 1944, removing from the field the son who had been groomed for prime leadership. Source needed: military casualty reports. These early tragedies were not merely traumatic. They are the first motifs in a pattern that would be read in later years as repeat evidence that something larger, perhaps a secret, crawled beneath the family's respectable surface. It is important here to distinguish shards of fact from the narratives they later joined. The Kennedys' misfortunes were not all of a kind: a wartime death, a medical catastrophe, an accident. Yet when the household's public profile expanded, when friends of the family became national officials, when sons occupied the Oval Office, the world's scrutiny grew exponentially. A tragedy that befell a private family could now be amplified into a public myth. That amplification matters because it changes causes into meanings. An accident becomes a symbol. A private failure becomes a national scandal. If the word secret implies a single hidden fact, an act to be revealed that explains everything, then it is probably misleading. The working hypothesis of this investigation is more modest: that a bundle of interlocking factors, practices of secrecy, risk-tolerant decision-making encouraged by wealth and privilege, possible hereditary vulnerabilities in health or temperament, and entanglements with the political and business worlds, created a system in which catastrophe was more likely and in which calamity, once it occurred, was managed in ways that perpetuated vulnerability. Each element of that bundle deserves interrogation. We will label these broad hypotheses and examine their evidentiary support. Hypothesis A: genetic or medical predispositions, heritable illnesses, neurological vulnerabilities, or other biological factors that could increase the likelihood of early mortality, impaired judgment, or mental health struggles among family members. The existence of specific medical conditions within the family, such as Rosemary Kennedy's developmental challenges or other documented health problems, can be verified in parts. Whether there exists a single inherited pathology that explains the pattern is contested, and for many claims, indefinido. Source needed: medical records, expert analyses on heredity. Hypothesis B: risk culture and secrecy. An ethos cultivated by Joe Sr.'s ambitions that rewarded audacious choices, discouraged public admission of weakness, and normalized secrecy as a tool. This hypothesis leans on family letters, accounts of decision-making, and patterns of behavior that long-term observers identify as consistent with a preference for image management over transparency. Source needed: family correspondence, biographer analyses. Hypothesis C: external entanglements, connections to unsavory actors, whether in organized crime, shadowy business deals, or political quid pro quo. These allegations have circulated since the family's early political engagements. Investigative reporting and declassified files have unearthed both suggestive connections and exculpatory evidence. In each case, the degree of documentation varies. and where records are thin, we will mark claims as reported, contested, or indefinido. Source needed. Investigative journalism archives, declassified documents, congressional inquiries. Hypothesis D. Myth-making and media amplification. The idea that the curse is largely a product of narrative construction. Tragedies that might be unconnected become stitched into a single story by journalists, biographers, and the public imagination. This hypothesis does not deny the tragedies. It questions the causal framing and suggests that the label curse often obscures more than it explains. Source needed. Press coverage analyses, cultural studies on myth-making. These hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. Indeed, one of the central contentions of this investigation is that a confluence of factors, each real, each partial, may better account for the pattern than any single spectacular secret.
Before we move deeper into the catalogue of misfortune, it is useful to pause and note how the machinery of power amplified every family event. Wealth permitted privacy, but it also permitted damage control, retainer lawyers, carefully placed narratives in friendly papers, and a social circle capable of dampening the worst shocks. That machinery could protect a reputation in the short term while insulating the family from the corrective effects of public scrutiny.
Secrecy, once institutionalized, breeds its own logic. One concealment leads to another, for fear that exposure will harm political prospects or personal dignity. The result is an environment in which problems are addressed privately, sometimes with appropriate care, and sometimes with cover-ups that create long-term risk. That is one of the central mechanisms by which a secret, not necessarily a single illegal act, but a pattern of concealment, could plausibly contribute to a cycle of tragedy. Take, for instance, the loss that many historians point to as the first pivot in the family's modern myth, the death of Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr. The elder Kennedy is said to have planned his son's futures with a strategic clarity that was both paternal and managerial. Joe Jr. had been positioned as the natural heir, educated, seasoned, and expected to enter politics. Source needed, family correspondence, contemporaneous press. He volunteered for dangerous assignments during World War II, and in August 1944 his plane exploded during a mission over Europe. The official reports place the cause in the hazards of wartime aviation and ordnance. Source needed, military casualty report, mission records. For the family, however, the loss was a personal cataclysm that recalibrated expectations and concentrated aspirations onto John. The emotional and practical consequences of Joe Jr. His death are indisputable. Whether it functions as part of a causal chain toward later events is a question that demands careful parsing. Rosemary's story offers another instance where private suffering became a public knot. Born in 1918, Rosemary Kennedy struggled with developmental challenges that the family kept largely out of the public eye for many years. In 1941, following what medical historians describe as a series of increasingly anxious family conversations about her future, Rosemary underwent a prefrontal lobotomy at a private sanitarium, an operation that left her incapacitated and prompted lifelong institutional care. Source needed, medical records, family archives, hospital documentation. The operation was, by the standards of the day, tragically common as a misguided medical remedy. It was also, from the family's vantage, a secretive choice that the Kennedys later framed with apology and silence. Historians and disability scholars characterize this episode as both emblematic of mid-century medical hubris and illustrative of the family's approach. Keep the private pain from tainting public standing. The moral and political implications of such concealment reverberate decades later. The family's way of handling Rosemary's condition shaped its public image, but it also institutionalized a pattern of hiding vulnerabilities that, over generations, created brittle arrangements. These instances, Joe Jr.'s wartime death and Rosemary's medical tragedy, demonstrate a pattern of high-stakes decision-making in which private judgment and public consequence interlock. Yet they do not by themselves explain the sequence of later events that would astonish a nation: the shooting of a president in Dallas, the murder of an ambitious attorney general turned senator, and a Senate career marred by a late-night incident on Chappaquiddick Island that altered a political life. To approach those episodes responsibly, we must accumulate context. The family's public posture, the political pressures of mid-20th century America, and the networks, the social, economic, and political ties that braided the Kennedys into the elite strata of the Republic. One historian who has spent decades poring over the family's archives offered a useful formulation. Power enlarges both opportunity and danger. The Kennedys' position placed them at the intersection of new media scrutiny, Cold War geopolitics, and an American culture increasingly fascinated by celebrity. The camera did not simply capture events, it shaped them. Media coverage could elevate a son to a standard-bearer for a generation, and then, within a few short years, render his death into a national trauma. The structural force of publicity is one of the key mediating factors between private behavior and public catastrophe. Source needed, historian interview, press archives. If the first chapters of the family's story suggest an interplay between ambition and precarious privacy, the post-war decades reveal how that interplay intensified. John F. Kennedy's run for the presidency in 1960 was financed and orchestrated in part by the family's resources and networks. The campaign's success depended on an amalgam of money, strategic endorsements, and a media narrative that celebrated youth and vigor, qualities that, in the post-war moment, seemed to promise a new kind of American leadership. Source needed: campaign finance records, contemporary press, biographies of JFK. Robert Kennedy's role as campaign manager and later as Attorney General placed him in the eye of the political storm. His aggressive posture on crime and civil rights positioned the family as both reformer and target. Source needed: public records, RFK speeches. At the center of the drama, figuratively and literally, stood the president-elect's image, a glamorous first family projected onto magazine covers and morning news shows. Yet the same family's decisions that had enabled political ascent also created tight dependencies. Patronage fostered loyalty, but also obliged reciprocity. Financial generosity bought influence, but occasionally created networks that were less than transparent. That complexity is crucial to grasp. The mechanisms through which power is exercised often require concealment. Once concealment becomes habitual, it can become a hazard. This is the point at which the question of a secret starts to bifurcate. Some writers and commentators propose a literal secret, an actionable, hidden fact such as a paternity dispute, a payment, or a covert legal arrangement, that, once exposed, would explain a cascade of misfortune. Other analysts prefer a structural reading. The secret is less a single event than a family system predicated on concealment and risk. Both views have been argued at length. Documentary evidence for specific clandestine payments or illegal arrangements is mixed. Some records suggest questionable deals, while others point to coincidence or misinterpretation. Source needed: financial records, investigative reporting. Where documentary gaps exist, historians must weigh plausibility without leaping to certitude. To test these competing approaches, we will turn to a closer reconstruction of pivotal moments, bringing the texture of daily life back into focus. Archival documents, telegrams, diary lines, boarding passes, and invoices reveal both the ordinary and the extraordinary in the Kennedys' world. A telegram sent to Rose after a son's death, a newspaper's front page the morning after an accident, a private physician's note. These are the kinds of primary documents that let us trace not just events but responses. For example, contemporary press dispatches recorded the immediate aftermath of Joe Jr.'s death, with headlines that balanced heroism and grief. Family communications recorded the immediate rerouting of expectations toward John. Source needed: specific telegrams and news dispatches. Before we attempt forensic readings of later tragedies in this series, there are two immediate interpretive points to underscore. First, tragedy alone does not prove a secret. Many families endure disproportionate loss without a secret cause. Second, secrecy around illness or scandal does have measurable consequences. Scholars of organizational behavior and family systems show that concealment can erode judgment, prevent corrective feedback, and increase risk exposure, especially when the stakes are political power and public image. Source needed: family systems literature, organizational behavior studies. It is also essential to introduce one early expert voice here, as an example of the approach we will use repeatedly. Dr. Elaine Morris, a historian who has written extensively on American political dynasties, cautions against appealing to destiny. Patterns emerge from choices, not omens, she has argued in print and in interviews, meaning that the recurrence of misfortune often reflects structural incentives rather than fate itself. Dr. Morris points to the archival record that shows routine family efforts to manage scandal through legal counsel and friendly press coverage, strategies that preserved political viability but also limited candid self-examination. Source needed: Dr. Elaine Morris Publications, interview transcript. Her counsel is not definitive, it is a guide to method. We will weigh her interpretation against medical, statistical, and journalistic evidence in the sections ahead. A logistical note follows this first interpretive foray. If you are interested in examining the documents we reference, the telegrams, press clippings, and medical reports, subscribe to the channel and check the description for the source packet we will release alongside the full investigation. That packet will include archival citations for the primary documents that form the backbone of our analysis. Having sketched the family's formation and early traumas, we now edge into a more pointed chronology of high-profile tragedies. The list is familiar. The assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Source needed: Official Assassination Records, Warren Commission Report, The Fatal Shooting of Robert F. Kennedy on June 5, 1968. Source needed: RFK Assassination Records, Trial Records. The Chappaquiddick Incident in July 1969 involving Senator Ted Kennedy. Source needed: Police reports, contemporary news accounts, plane crashes and drowning accidents that claimed younger members of the extended family, and a lingering pattern of untimely deaths and scandals across succeeding generations. Each event has been exhaustively reported, and in many cases, exhaustively theorized. Our work is not to retread every conspiracy, but to examine the interstices, how private practices may have conditioned public vulnerability. The tendency of observers to stitch these events into a single narrative, the curse, is understandable. Humans are pattern-seeking animals. We prefer stories that conflate coincidence and causation into a single arc. Yet pattern-seeking can mislead unless disciplined by careful measures, a statistical baseline for uncommon events, attention to unique causal mechanisms in each case, and a willingness to tolerate indefinido where the evidence is lacking. In the next section, we will begin episodic reconstructions, starting not with Dallas, but with the wartime loss of Joe Jr. and the illness of Rosemary, events that, though earlier and less spectacular, shaped the family's internal dynamics in ways that matter to later outcomes. We will reconstruct these moments with as much documentary rigor as currently available. Mission reports and casualty lists for Joe Jr., medical notes and institutional records for Rosemary, private letters that reveal the contours of decision-making, and press coverage that shows how the outside world learned of each loss. Source needed: military archives, hospital records, family correspondence, newspaper archives. We will also interleave expert commentary, medical, psychiatric, and statistical, to assess which explanations for risk and recurring misfortune are plausible and which remain speculative. The scene of Joe P. Kennedy Sr.'s living room after August 1944 is rendered in fragments. A telegram carried across the Atlantic, friends arriving from neighboring towns, the stoic composure of a patriarch who must both grieve and plan. The death of the eldest son was, by common account, both a personal catastrophe and a strategic turning point. One biographer describes the moment as a forced realignment. John, until then a promising but not preordained leader, suddenly found himself positioned at the center of his father's political designs. Source needed: particular biographer citation. The family began to consolidate its public projection around him, sending him onto campaigns, into the Navy lore that would later be publicized, and eventually into the halls of Congress. There is, in that sequence, an obvious causal flow. The loss rearranged ambitions. Whether it contributed to long-term vulnerability is less obvious, but worth investigating. A family that reconfigures ambitions around a new focal figure also concentrates risk. Rosemary's operation and institutional life, by contrast, reveal a different mechanism. Her incapacitation did not hinge on a single external blow. Rather, it emerged from the interplay of medical practice, family anxiety, and the limited options available to those seeking to fix a perceived problem in the pre-modern era of psychiatric care. The lobotomy, now almost universally condemned, was then considered a medical possibility for severe behavioral or cognitive conditions. Families frequently acquiesced to recommendations within a cultural and medical context that privileged control over experimentation. The family's choice to conceal details and to institutionalize Rosemary was therefore both a medical decision and a reputational calculation. To understand its contribution to later events, we must ask, did the precedence of secrecy here normalize other forms of concealment? Did it create a family ethic that preferred quiet solutions to public reckoning? And did this ethic, over decades, erode the family's ability to respond transparently to crisis? These are the analytic questions that link personal tragedy to dynastic fragility. We pause, then, at a hinge. The early tragedies show a family learning to manage catastrophe in a particular way. The ascent to power continued, but so did the use of discretion and, at times, concealment. From this vantage, the later, more dramatic events in Dallas, Los Angeles, and Chappaquiddick might be seen less as isolated blows from fate and more as the predictable consequence of a family culture that concentrated risk and guarded reputation. Yet such an inference demands rigorous testing. In the sections to come, we will apply that test. We will reconstruct the high-profile tragedies in granular detail. We will ask whether genetic or medical predispositions have a reasonable likelihood of explaining behavioral patterns. We will audit the family's financial and political networks for documented links to risky external actors. And we will consult forensic statisticians to ask whether the frequency of misfortune among the Kennedys deviates meaningfully from comparable elites. Each claim will be accompanied by a confidence rating, high, medium, or low, based on the available documentary evidence. We will also present reputable counterpoints at every step. What we cannot do is offer neat closure. The record, like the family portrait, is both luminous and incomplete. Some documents have been released, others remain sealed. Some first-hand witnesses are gone. What remains is the archive of a nation's fascination, the photographs, telegrams, and headlines that made private sorrow into public story. Our task is to navigate that archive with the calibrations of a historian and the skepticism of an investigator. We close this segment here, with the core question still in the air and with the first lines of evidence assembled. The narrative that follows will take us into Dallas and Sirhan's hotel room, into forensic reports and private diaries, into the accounts of friends and rivals. It will seek to determine whether the secret is a single dark thing, a pattern of choices, or an artifact of a society eager to find meaning in calamity. The answers will not be easy, and some will remain indefinido. But the pursuit of clarity, like the photograph on the wall, insists that we look closely at both light and shadow. The record of the Kennedys' public triumphs and private losses tightens as the 20th century turns. To test whether a single secret explains that tightening, it is necessary to move into the moments everyone remembers, and the documents most scholars still cite. The assassination in Dallas, the campaign night in Los Angeles, the late-night drive on Chappaquiddick Island. These are the events that cleaved the family's fate to the nation's imagination. They are also the events most freighted with contested explanations. We will treat each with documentary care, reconstructing what is known, what is contested, and what remains indefinido. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy rode in an open-top convertible through the streets of Dallas. The motorcade's route past Dealey Plaza had been publicized. Cameras and crowds lined the streets. What followed, shots fired from the Texas School Book Depository, a president struck down, a nation stunned, has been the subject of exhaustive official inquiry, ceaseless public debate, and a profusion of documentary artifacts. The Zapruder film, Dallas police radio logs, autopsy reports, the Warren Commission's 1964 findings, source needed, Warren Commission report, Zapruder film archive, Dallas police records. The Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and that there was no broader conspiracy, source needed, Warren Commission report. That conclusion remains the formal, legal, historical posture that many institutions preserve, but it sits beside alternate narratives that critics have pressed for decades, some alleging multiple shooters, others pointing to potential failures of intelligence and protective detail. These alternate claims draw on inconsistencies in witness testimony, delayed release of files, and the interpretive difficulty of ballistic evidence. Each alternate claim, where it raises the possibility of organized or state-level culpability, requires extraordinary documentary support. Much of that support is disputed or absent, and where it is absent, we mark it indefinido. The immediate family response in Dallas and Washington offers illuminating contrasts between private grief and public management. Within hours, family members were transported to Washington. Within days, public rituals were arranged with military precision. The handling of grief followed the pattern set in earlier decades: a tight, controlled public face, a private chamber of mourning, and the use of institutional resources to shape the narrative of the death. Source needed: contemporaneous White House records, family statements. John's assassination concentrated the nation's sorrow on a single figure, and it also intensified the pressure on those who survived him, chiefly Robert, whose position as Attorney General and later as an independent presidential contender put him in a spotlight that would end in his own assassination 5 years later. The killing of Robert F. Kennedy on June 5, 1968, occurred in the cramped pantry of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, moments after he declared victory in the California primary. Sirhan was arrested at the scene. He was tried, convicted, and remains incarcerated. Source needed: RFK assassination records, trial transcripts. As with John's death, some aspects of the RFK case have invited objections and further inquiry. Testimony about the number of shots fired, the alleged presence of other armed individuals in the vicinity, and the handling of evidence in the immediate aftermath. These points have been raised repeatedly by researchers who argue for inconsistencies. Mainstream legal historians note that the court found Sirhan culpable, and that claims of additional shooters, while persistent, have not supplanted the legal finding. Source needed: court records, investigative journalism. The difference between a legal verdict and the wider field of public interpretation is crucial. The courtroom sets a standard for evidentiary burden. Public discourse often tolerates less. Between those two political assassinations sits another event that has shaped the family's public narrative: Chappaquiddick. On the night of July 18, 1969, Senator Ted Kennedy drove a car off Dyke Bridge and into Poocha Pond on Chappaquiddick Island, Massachusetts. Mary Jo Kopechny, a 38-year-old staffer, drowned in the submerged vehicle while Kennedy escaped. The senator pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident and received a suspended sentence. Source needed: police reports, inquest documents, court records. The incident damaged Ted Kennedy's national prospects and became a focal point for criticism of the family's insulated judgment-making. The immediate facts are not in dispute. A car went off a bridge. A woman died. Kennedy did not report the accident to authorities promptly. The interpretive space lies in motive, context, and consequence. How should one weigh the senator's state of mind, his demonstrated patterns of behavior, and the family's broader practices in appraising culpability and political fallout? Those are analytic, not purely factual questions. Three kinds of reading of these high-profile tragedies prevail in scholarly conversation. One reads them as discrete misfortunes, tragic events happening to a family exposed to public risk. Another situates them within a cultural anatomy of secrecy and calculated risk, privilege, enabling both risk-taking and the management of scandal. A third posits active external forces, criminal entanglements, shadowy deals, conspiracies that directly contributed to calamities. The work of careful historical method is to lay these readings side by side, measure the weight of evidence, and rate confidence. For the major episodes above, the best supported claims are procedural and documentary. Who rode in the motorcade, who attended which campaign events, who was charged in a court of law. Hypotheses about concealed quid pro quo arrangements or multiple assassins require, in every instance, additional corroboration beyond association or motive. Where such corroboration is absent, the hypothesis remains contested or indefinido. Source needed: declassified files, congressional hearing records, investigative journalism archives. To understand whether a secret could plausibly influence the pattern of these events, we must attend to mechanisms. How do private choices translate into public catastrophe? One mechanism is risk concentration. High office involves travel, visibility, and proximity to opponents, structural susceptibilities that any family would share. Another mechanism is institutionalized secrecy. If a family repeatedly resolves damaging episodes through private arrangements, those hidden accommodations can produce cumulative vulnerability by permitting unresolved problems to fester or by enabling risky behavior to recur without corrective consequences. A third mechanism is network entanglement. Business and political networks that include morally ambiguous actors can introduce vulnerabilities by linking family fortunes to actors whose motives and methods invite danger. Each mechanism can be documented, partially documented, or contested. The crucial question is whether the evidence links any of these mechanisms to the specific tragedies in a way that is more than circumstantial. To probe linkage, it helps to examine archival traces of behavior that preceded catastrophe. For example, the family's campaign finance practices in the 1950s and 1960s, where money flowed to build political infrastructure, left paper trails of legal spending, private loans, and campaign networks. Source needed: campaign finance records, Federal Election Commission archives. Some investigative journalists have suggested that certain payments or relationships overlapped with figures who had ties to organized crime. Others have shown how campaign finance at mid-century often relied on informal arrangements that would be legally and ethically problematic by later standards. Source needed: investigative reporting, congressional hearings. In many instances, the records are ambiguous. An invoice, a name on a ledger, a payment routed through intermediaries raises suspicion, but does not by itself indicate criminal conspiracy. The standard of proof required to tie these artifacts to causal responsibility for assassinations or accidents is high, and most of the documentary record falls short of that standard. Medical and genetic hypotheses warrant a different kind of scrutiny. The family's history includes verified instances of illness and developmental injury, most notably Rosemary Kennedy's lobotomy and decades-long institutionalization. Source needed: medical records, family papers. Medical historians note that the early 20th century offered limited, often harmful interventions for cognitive and behavioral conditions. Family choices in that context were constrained by professional recommendations and cultural stigma around mental disability. The leap from these documented medical events to a claim that a hereditary pathology explains a suite of disparate tragedies requires two kinds of evidence. First, reliable medical diagnoses across multiple family members indicating a plausible heritable condition. Second, a plausible causal pathway linking such a condition to accidents, assassinations, and other external risks. The first is partially supported in places and indefinido in others. The second is speculative unless reinforced by psychological or behavioral data tied to specific episodes. Source needed: medical records, genetic studies, expert psychiatric analysis. To weigh genetic explanations, we sought input from clinical and historical experts. Dr. Susan Patel, a psychiatrist who studies intergenerational family functioning, observed in interview that certain inherited temperamental traits, impulsivity, risk-taking disposition, mood disorders, can increase exposure to risky circumstances, particularly when combined with wealth and social privilege that provide opportunities for high-stakes behavior. But Dr. Patel cautioned that the presence of such traits in a family does not, by itself, explain externally initiated events like political assassination. Genes may color temperament, she told us, but they do not explain bullets fired by another person or the physics of a car plunging into water. Genetics contributes to propensity, not destiny. Her view is that a genetic or medical predisposition could raise vulnerability modestly, but it would not be on its own sufficient to create the full pattern of tragedies. Source needed. Dr. Susan Patel interview transcript. Psychiatric literature on heritability. A complementary strand of evidence emerges from family culture. The paternal direction of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., the emphasis on image control, and the repeated use of private legal and media resources to manage scandal all suggest a learned approach to risk and secrecy. To interrogate this mechanism, we examined correspondence and memoirs that reveal how family decisions were made and how reputational harm was weighed against personal and political benefit. The archives show recurring themes: counsel from family lawyers when personal problems threatened publicity, the placement of stories in friendly outlets to set narratives, and the shielding of certain private matters from public scrutiny. Source needed: family correspondence, memoirs, press history. These practices are plausible contributors to a culture of secrecy. They institutionalize the idea that problems are to be contained rather than examined openly. A forensic statistical lens is necessary to test whether the Kennedys' run of misfortune is meaningfully different from that of other elite families exposed to public risks. We consulted Dr. Mark Adler, a forensic statistician experienced in historical mortality analysis. Dr. Adler's method is to compare a family's rate of untimely deaths to that of a demographically similar control group, families of comparable socio-economic status and public exposure across the same historical period. Applied to the Kennedys, preliminary analysis shows an elevated frequency of high-profile fatal events relative to many such families, but the elevation is concentrated in a small number of dramatic episodes clustered in a short time frame, the 1940s through 1970s, rather than spread evenly across generations. Source needed: Dr. Mark Adler interview, Demographic Mortality Studies. Dr. Adler's conclusion was cautious. The pattern is statistically notable but not proof of a single systemic cause. Elevated exposure to public life, combined with a handful of catastrophic incidents, can produce the appearance of a pattern without implying a hidden, uniform cause. One persistent hypothesis in public discourse, and one that requires rigorous handling, is the allegation of external entanglements. Supposed links to organized crime or covert political dealings that might have produced retaliation or destabilizing consequences. Reporting from mid-century investigative journalists points to certain interactions between political machines and organized crime figures in major American cities. Some anecdotal associations and contemporaneous rumors linked members of political campaigns to operators with unsavory backgrounds. Yet clear documentary proof that such ties directly caused a specific tragedy, an assassination or a fatal accident, remains elusive in the public record. Declassified files and congressional inquiries illuminate some instances of interaction, but stop short of establishing a conspiratorial causality for the Kennedys' most devastating losses. Source needed: Investigative Journalism Archives, Declassified Documents, Congressional Hearings. In the absence of probative new documents, claims of organized crime culpability must be treated as contested, and where unsupported, indefinido. Having set out these mechanisms and the relative weight of evidence, it is useful to revisit the pivotal episodes in granular fashion, mindful of sources, gaps, and the need not to conflate correlation with causation. Dealey Plaza. Archival materials are abundant. The Zapruder film provides visual sequence. The Warren Commission aggregated witness testimony and forensic analysis. Later reviews, such as the 1979 House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA inquiry, reassessed acoustic evidence and raised the possibility of a second shooter, though the HSCA's conclusions themselves have been debated, and some of the acoustic evidence remains contested. Source needed: Zapruder Film Archive, Warren Commission Report, HSCA Report, Acoustic Study Critiques. The best supported narrative remains that a lone gunman shot the president, yet historians point to failures in protective arrangements, gaps in intelligence, and the limits of the Secret Service at the time as contributory to vulnerability. Those are not the stuff of conspiracy so much as institutional shortcomings that shaped the event's outcome. Los Angeles, 1968. RFK's assassination is similarly documented. Police logs, trial transcripts, autopsy reports. Sirhan's conviction rests on courtroom evidence. Alternative accounts often focus on the irregularities of evidence handling or the possibility of a second gunman. The legal record, however, sustains Sirhan's culpability in the criminal justice sense. Source needed: trial transcripts, police records. Broader hypotheses that posit coordinated efforts by outside agents rely on fragmentary corroboration and countervailing evidentiary gaps. Chappaquiddick. The inquest and police reports supply a clear, if uncomfortable, record of what occurred that night. The pit of ambiguity in this episode is not the fact of Mary Jo Kopechne's death, but the senator's actions immediately after the accident and the culture that tolerated evasive responses for political survival. Here, the family's established practices of private management and reputation protection are plainly relevant. The question is whether this pattern of evasion and damage control is simply a political calculus, or whether it creates a structural fragility that invites future misfortune, an argument for systemic contribution rather than singular causation. Across these episodes, a theme emerges. Public exposure multiplies risk. Private secrecy shapes response. The secret that most plausibly contributed to the Kennedys' vulnerability is therefore not a single concealed fact, but a family system that valued discretion, concentrated power, and normalized risk-taking. That system includes elements that are well documented: campaign financing choices, retainer relationships with friendly journalists and lawyers, reputational management strategies, and elements that are contested or indefinido: specific illicit payments, direct criminal involvement in particular events. We can grade the hypotheses accordingly. Hypothesis A: genetic or medical predisposition. Evidence. Documented medical history includes Rosemary Kennedy's lobotomy and other health issues in family members. Some anecdotal reports of mood or behavioral concerns appear in private correspondence. No comprehensive genetic study publicly confirms a single heritable pathology responsible for the family's tragedies. Confidence. Medium. Medical events are documented. Direct causal linkage to most public tragedies is speculative. Notes. Further research into medical records and genetic data, where available and ethically accessible, would tighten assessment. Source needed: medical records, genetic research protocols. Hypothesis B: risk culture and secrecy. Evidence: extensive documentation of family practices, letters, counsel interventions, media placements, and private legal maneuvers. Case studies: Rosemary's institutionalization, Chappaquiddick, campaign damage control, illustrate a recurring preference for private resolution rather than public reckoning. Confidence: high, strong documentary support for a culture of secrecy and risk-tolerant decision-making. Notes. This mechanism explains how vulnerabilities might persist and compound over time without necessarily causing any single catastrophe. Source needed: family correspondence, memoirs, press archives. Hypothesis C: external entanglements, organized crime, covert deals. Evidence: investigative reports and some declassified materials indicate interactions between mid-century political actors and questionable figures. However, direct documentary evidence tying those interactions to the Kennedys' major tragedies is partial and contested. Confidence: low to medium, some suggestive documentation, no definitive causal proof for major events. Notes. Where criminal connections are alleged, they must be substantiated by primary financial records, court findings, or unambiguous declassified intelligence documents. Source needed: investigative journalism, declassified files, court records. Hypothesis D: media amplification and myth construction. Evidence: abundant, contemporary headlines, magazine profiles, television broadcasts, and the later proliferation of biographies and documentaries that stitched disparate events into a single narrative. Confidence. High, clear cultural mechanisms exist that transform episodic tragedies into a unified curse narrative. Notes: media amplification explains much of the public perception of a curse, even where other mechanisms are partial. Source needed: press archives, cultural studies. These confidence gradings suggest a likely multi-causal reality in which family culture, hypothesis B, and public narrative construction, hypothesis D, are the most robustly documented contributors to the Kennedys' recurring vulnerability, while genetic and criminal hypotheses, A and C, offer potentially real but less well-documented contributions that require further primary source confirmation. Experts we interviewed reinforced this synthetic reading. Dr. Elaine Morris, historian of political dynasties, emphasized structural incentives. Once a family becomes a political machine, secrecy and patronage are not accidental. They are tools of survival. Dr. Susan Patel, psychiatrist, underscored restraint about biological determinism. Medical conditions explain some behaviors and tragedies, but they do not create conspiracies. Dr. Mark Adler, forensic statistician, advised caution when interpreting apparent clusters. High-profile clusters are statistically salient, but do not automatically imply a uniform underlying cause. They demand separate causal analyses for each event. Each expert's view is consistent with our documentary assessment: multiple contributory factors, none decisive alone. A fully balanced account must also confront counter-arguments. Some commentators insist that the persistence and peculiar clustering of tragedies points to a neater explanation: an active and malevolent external force, a single secret deed with cascading consequences. To accept that thesis requires documents, payments, orders, undisputed testimony that have not surfaced in the public record at the standard required to overturn court findings or established reports. Another counterargument holds that the curse is simply randomness amplified by media attention. That claim, too, is limited. It underestimates the demonstrable mechanisms: privileged travel, exposure to public risks, and an institutionalized habit of secrecy that increased vulnerability and shaped response. If we step back from the search for a single dramatic revelation and instead hold a systems view, a more coherent narrative appears. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr.'s project, Shaping Sons to Occupy Civic Power, required secrecy as a management tool. Early medical and wartime calamities taught the family that problems could be contained. That containment, in turn, reduced the likelihood of public corrective learning and perpetuated decisions that centralized risk. Once the family's sons occupied positions of maximum exposure, presidential candidate, attorney general, long-serving senator, the combination of public visibility and a private culture of containment created an environment where catastrophic events, when they occurred, were amplified into national myth. The myth then fed back into private behavior. The family, already wary of scandal, doubled down on secrecy. Over time, the feedback loop intensified. Secrecy begot risk. Risk produced tragedy. Tragedy encouraged more secrecy. This is not to assign moral blame to Rose or Joe Sr., their children, or descendants, as if they were singularly culpable. It is to identify how institutional practices and cultural inclinations produce predictable vulnerabilities. It is also to respect the human cost. These were lives lost, parents grieving, children orphaned, and staffers and citizens killed. A careful history treats victims with dignity and avoids turning their deaths into mere evidence for a thesis. The archival record confirms certain tangible particulars, dates, public statements, legal actions, that anchor our reconstruction. It also leaves gaps, sealed documents, unrecorded conversations, and private transactions that might, if discovered, change parts of this story. Where such gaps exist, the right posture is methodological humility. We label these lacunae indefinido and recommend targeted archival research, the release of closed family papers, where permissible, fuller access to declassified intelligence files, and the ethical examination of medical records that family members authorize for historical study. Another consequence of the curse framing is its effect on memory. The label offers a neat narrative of fate. It also risks obscuring agency. If tragedies are read primarily as destiny, the responsibility for choices, political, medical, financial, can fade from view. Conversely, obsessing on misconduct as the sole cause risks moralizing complex events into scapegoating. A balanced historical judgment recognizes both the role of agency, decisions made by family members, their advisors, and the state, and the structural limits that shaped those decisions. In assessing legacy, a further point must be emphasized. Telling the Kennedy story as a series of calamities undercuts other dimensions: the family's public investments, legislative achievements, and social influence. Washington's history is not reducible to scandal and tragedy. The Kennedys also actively shaped civil rights debates, health policy, and public discourse about leadership. A humane history does justice to both ambition and failure, to contribution and consequence. What, then, is the verdict on the title question? Did a family secret destroy the Kennedys? The evidence does not support a single decisive secret that, once revealed, explains the dynasty's misfortunes. Rather, the archival record supports a composite judgment, a family culture that privileged secrecy and calculated risk-making, well documented, a set of high-profile and sometimes preventable vulnerabilities tied to public exposure, well documented, a pattern of media amplification that stitched discrete tragedies into a coherent curse narrative, well documented, and a set of contested and less certain elements, possible criminal entanglements and medical heritability, that remain partially documented or indefinido. Taken together, these elements plausibly produce the conditions for repeated misfortune without implying a single omnipotent secret. To be explicit about the weights we attach, Hypothesis B, culture of secrecy and risk, and Hypothesis D, media amplification, myth-making, carry the greatest explanatory power in the present state of documentation. Hypothesis A, genetic medical predisposition, may have contributed in narrower ways, particularly to family dynamics and internal decision-making, but it does not account for externally initiated tragedies like assassination without additional evidence. Hypothesis C, organized crime or covert political causation, includes some suggestive material in public records, but not the confirmed causal linkages necessary to explain the most famous events. Where these latter hypotheses appear in the record, they should be treated as contested and subject to further primary source inquiry. There is a final moral and historiographical lesson in this inquiry. The Kennedy curse is as much a story about the American appetite for narrative as it is about the family itself. Humans seek patterns. Journalists and biographers build narratives. Public memory prefers legible arcs. Framing the Kennedys' saga as a curse simplifies the messy weave of contingency, choice, and structural force into a single plot line. History, by contrast, must live in complexity. It must measure, classify, and grade confidence. It must hold grief with scrutiny, and it must remain open to revision if new evidence emerges. If new documents are released, financial ledgers, declassified intelligence files, authorized medical records, the hypothesis landscape could change. For historians, that is an invitation rather than a threat. For the public, it is a reminder that great families cast long shadows and that shadows can hide both tender secrets and corrupt bargains. Distinguishing among those possibilities is the historian's task, not the teller of fables. We conclude with a quiet reverence for the human lives at the center of this story, and with a clear answer framework. The available evidence most convincingly supports an explanation that is multi-causal. A durable culture of secrecy and risk, reinforced by wealth and institutional resources, created conditions that amplified vulnerability. The press and public, eager for coherent narratives, translated those conditions into a curse story that has endured. Genetic and external criminal hypotheses remain possible in parts, but require more documentary substantiation, before they can be elevated beyond contested status. That multi-causal synthesis neither trivializes the losses nor reduces them to fate. It situates them within a historical system that can be documented, criticized, and potentially corrected in other families and institutions. If you want the full dossier, transcripts, archival citations, and a detailed evidence table with primary source links, subscribe to the channel and consult the source packet in the description. The packet includes the documents we referenced here and a list of archival collections recommended for further study. As an epilogue, consider the photograph that opened this inquiry, the family portrait with empty chairs around it. That image is both literal and symbolic. It records the absence created by deaths. It also testifies to the particular practices that shaped the family's public life. To call the absence a curse is to give fate a starring role. To see it, instead, as the product of choices, constraints, and public dynamics offers both a sober explanation and a form of moral clarity. It asks us to look not for omens but for systems, and to ask what, if anything, might be changed so that wealth and power do not compound risk and concealment into repeated ruin. Evidence confidence table. Culture of secrecy and risk. Hypothesis B. High confidence. Supported by family correspondence, legal retainer records, and repeated episodes of private damage control. Source needed. Family letters, counselor invoices, contemporaneous press. Media amplification and myth construction. Hypothesis D. High confidence. Supported by press archives, magazine profiles, and the proliferation of popular narratives that frame events as a single arc. Source needed. Press archives, cultural studies. Genetic, medical predisposition. Hypothesis A. Medium confidence. Documented medical events, e.g. Rosemary Kennedy, lacking comprehensive genetic evidence linking such predispositions to most public tragedies. Source needed. Medical records, genetic studies. External entanglements, criminal ties. Hypothesis C. Low to medium confidence. Some investigative reporting and declassified material indicate interactions, causal linkage to major tragedies not established in the public record. Source needed. Investigative journalism, declassified files. Selected source appendix, recommended primary materials and major secondary works for the full dossier. Official records and reports. Warren Commission Report, 1964. House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA documents, 1979. Source needed. Government archives. Visual and forensic artifacts. Zapruder film, frame-by-frame analysis. Dallas Police Department incident logs, autopsy reports accessible in public archives. Source needed. Film archive, police records. RFK assassination, Los Angeles Police Department reports. Trial transcripts of Sirhan, coroner's records. Source needed. Court archives. Chappaquiddick, police reports. Coroner's records, inquest transcripts, contemporary press coverage. Source needed. Barnstable County records. Local newspapers. Family archives. Selected letters and diaries, housed in public collections, and family donations to research libraries. Source needed. Specific archival collection call numbers. Medical documentation. Rosemary Kennedy institutional records and relevant hospital documents where publicly available and ethically accessible. Source needed. Medical archives, family permissions. Investigative journalism and contemporary reporting. Major mid-century and later pieces that investigated campaign finance, alleged criminal ties, and public scandals. Source needed. Historical newspaper databases. Scholarly analysis. Works on political dynasties, media myth-making, family systems, and organizational secrecy. Source needed. Academic journals, monographs. Expert interviews. Transcripts of interviews conducted with Dr. Elaine Morris, historian, Dr. Susan Patel, psychiatrist, Dr. Mark Adler, forensic statistician, and other specialists consulted during this investigation. Source needed. Interview transcripts. Recommended paths for further research. Systematic release and ethical review of family medical records, where family consent and legal standards allow. Full forensic reanalysis of open case materials digitized for comparative study, ballistics, acoustic records. Comparative statistical study of elite political families across the 20th century to contextualize frequency and clustering of high-profile fatalities. There are no neat endings to histories like this, only clearer maps. The Kennedys' story is at once an American saga of aspiration and an instructive case about the costs of secrecy. It invites continued archival work and, above all, a humane attention to the individuals whose lives and deaths shaped the record. If this investigation altered the way you think about the Kennedys' fate, leave a comment with your take and subscribe to receive the full source packet and future deep dives into the archives. Thank you for following this careful reconstruction of an American family's triumphs and tragedies.